Joining me now, a doctor who is speaking out about the new race essentialism push in medicine. Dr. Marilyn Singleton is a Black physician who has so much to say about the obsessive focus on so-called DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, that we're seeing more and more in our culture. Marilyn, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me.
It's one thing to
be here.
Oh, well, thank you. So it's one thing to see this push in, like, I don't know, education. That's problematic enough. But it's quite another to see DEI take over medicine. And I know this is happening just from my own doctor friends who have complained about the changing of standards when it comes to who gets selected for residencies or elevated to chief resident, right down to how they interact with patients and how, I mentioned this yesterday, you're not supposed to offend a patient by asking what gender they are. It's some relevant information. But you've been living it firsthand and I should tell the audience a bit about your background. Graduated from Stanford, went on to UCSF medical school, 2 years of surgery at UCSF, then anesthesia residency at Harvard's Beth Israel. Went on to Cedars-Sinai Medical. You were a professor at Johns Hopkins. Then, while still working in medicine, you went to Berkeley Law School, focusing on con law and administrative law. So that's also impressive. But you've been noticing in California, where you've been licensed since 1974, this is creeping in, and in a really weird, pervasive, problematic way. Tell us.
Okay, this whole thing, there is no question that minorities have been wronged in the past. Certainly slavery is heinous, dreadful, awful. That's done. We know it. But we're now talking about having people go through what I equate to struggle sessions like the Maoists in China did, where in front of your friends and coworkers, you have to confess that you're a racist. And even though you haven't done anything, that it's implicit in just being a white person or a underrepresented minority, because mind you, Asians are minorities, but they're not underrepresented minorities. So they even had to come up with a new term for Blacks, Hispanics, and Indigenous people. Those are the BIPOCs. And it's absurd. When I'm saying it, I feel like I sound stupid even saying these words. Who is a BIPOC? Right. And this is what they're calling little children and grown-ups who are of other races that are minoritized. So we're not even minorities anymore. We're minoritized, meaning we're powerless. Well, all of this is such bunk and the wrong thing to be teaching young people as well as adults. And certainly all this has to start when we're young. That's another story. But going to medicine, it is damaging to the students who really wonder, have I been accepted to medical school because I'm bright, because I'm smart, because they like what I have to offer? Or am I being accepted because they need another colored person who they can add to their statistics? And sadly, that's how a lot of these young folks think. And when affirmative action first came out, this is one of the first things a lot of folks wondered. Am I smart? How do people really look at me? Are they going to think that I'm the dumb doctor? Will I get as many patients as the white doctor? And on and on. So that's one aspect. There's a very damaging psychological aspect. There's a damaging aspect to the collegiality among doctors of color and white doctors. People have been consulting back and forth for years with nary a thought of what race the doctor was. It's like, did you have the expertise that I don't have? And I'm going to ask you a question, and vice versa. Patients have been requesting doctors of all races and colors because they heard that person was good, so they go to that doctor. And now suddenly they're talking about Black patients need to have a Black doctor. Could you imagine if the tables were turned and everybody said white patients needed to have a white doctor? It's the most absurd thing I've ever heard of, not to mention you could never do it. There wouldn't be enough Black doctors to treat all the Black patients. And everybody I know, and admittedly, I worked in a hospital in West Hollywood and a nice part of town, but the Black doctors I knew wanted to work at nice hospitals. It's just not assumed because you're Black that you want to go work in an underprivileged hospital. Yes, some do, but there's plenty of white doctors that work there too. So some of the concepts that all of this is built on are just plain wrong, and it's divisive. It's not good for patients. Patients aren't thinking along those lines. I'm sure every now and then there's going to be some butthead who is a butthead no matter what, who says something that has a racist undertone or whatever. That's always going to happen. I don't care whether you're in medicine or anything else. And there's always going to be those people. There's always going to be sexist people and drunks who come in and say they don't want some C word taking care of them and all that. And you say, screw you. I'm a good doctor. This is who you get. And somehow they shut up right quick. So it angers me because I grew up when there wasn't fair housing in California. And even though my father had a good occupation and we could afford it, we couldn't live where we wanted to live. And so I see how things had improved. And then suddenly it was like falling off a cliff when they started all this focus on race. And it took Black people away from moving ahead on our own power. We didn't need the caring white liberal to get us ahead. We had our own power. And this is becoming a problem because it's sapping Black doctors of their ego and of their sense of pride in themselves. And how can somebody who's a successful cardiac surgeon suddenly be an oppressed victim? Well, they aren't. And it's all a narrative designed to move our society in a different direction.
And now, how does it change the dynamic between white doctors and Black doctors in the hospital or other settings, right? Because now it's like you're wondering, as the white person, I'm thinking like, does she see me as the oppressor? Does she think I'm a racist? Because California is telling her in these continuing legal education courses every year that I've got some implicit bias that's in there. I'm out to get her. I just think it creates this underlying dynamic of distrust.
Well, and it does, and it shouldn't. The thing is that the only thing that makes me hopeful about the whole thing is that most people are kind of normal and they know this is bullshit. They've had friends for years and interacted with folks for years and know who's good and who has the personality and who's the gynecologist to the stars, who happens to be a Black guy. And they didn't pick him because he was Black. They picked him because he had a great personality and was a good surgeon. All this sort of stuff. This is how real people are. And it's a veneer. It's something. And your last guest was talking about this transgender stuff being a performance. And that's what a lot of this racial stuff is. People are out there playing games, but they're playing games with people's lives. But for the most part, yes, it is going to breed distrust. And it's going to be the younger folk who don't know any better. The older guys, I'd say anybody late 40s plus, they know the score. They know that a good doctor can come in any skin color and they're not going to judge people by their color. Well, they haven't before.
Do you see, at the college level, certainly they're throwing out the SAT, they're throwing out standardized testing because they want to make sure that they can make sure they have enough BIPOC in the incoming class if the Supreme Court outlaws the use of race at all. And some say, okay, fine, so we're going to have a very diverse looking college class no matter what. When you make race the number one thing and you don't look at scores in medicine, I mean, that is scary to a lot of people. Like I for one, want my pilots and my doctors chosen 100% on merit. Like that, we're talking about human lives. So what do you make of that?
they're already talking about getting rid of the MCATs, which is like the SATs, but for medicine, and going pass fail. One can argue, and it is argued, that there's other factors that make a good doctor other than being really good at science or knowing all your physics equations and all that. And I grant you that. I didn't major in science, and I turned out to be a good doctor and got into good residencies and finished them. I think what's disturbing is you don't want patients to think you're not a good doctor because of the color of your skin. I had a older friend, an ENT doctor, whose father had to go in for prostate surgery. Now, mind you, his father's daughter, my friend's sister, had her appendix out, and the surgeon who operated on her was Black, and the father had picked out this surgeon. And when he went in for his prostate surgery, the anesthesiologist was Black, and the first thing he asked him was, "How old are you? Did you go to school before affirmative action?" This is what you don't want. And he was kind of old and getting senile, but it was like the truth was coming out, that people thinking that if you're post-affirmative action, that you're not as good as the other guy. You may well be. We don't know, but you don't want patients to think that. And you don't want to have people who aren't qualified. Now, studies have come out and they said more minority residents aren't completing the residency. And it's likely because they were chosen for the residency because of their color and not because of their skills. They weren't kicked out because the people who are the head of the residency are racist. If they didn't come up to a certain standard, then they're not going to finish the residency. And what you mentioned, the idea of changing the standards, that is where we have to draw the line. Merit is still merit. And frankly, I think in more professions than just pilots and doctors, you want people to be good at it.
I want my firemen just chosen on strength and courage and all the other things too. Can I ask you before we go? So I know that this is something on your radar as well, but I've been asked, so what do you think is the answer? What do you think is the answer to sort of educating our kids? And I've said, instead of talking about endlessly, of course, we teach slavery, we teach Jim Crow, but instead of endlessly highlighting the terrible plight of African Americans in America, why don't we start highlighting the amazing accomplishments of really strong, smart Black people and holding them up instead of putting them down, so that these little kids just say, "Oh my God, what, like all my people had this terrible history. What does that mean for me?" As opposed to, look at these amazing people. And I know this is near and dear to your own heart.
Well, absolutely. I think one of the first op-eds I ever wrote was about the first Black doctor who was a slave in the 1700s. And his master made him a nurse and taught him how to be a doctor. And then he ended up having a wonderful practice with patients of all colors. So when kids hear this, they think, we didn't think people who were slaves could ever do anything. And some people didn't realize that 10% of Black people in America were never slaves. So there's so much history, but it's hidden. Booker T. Washington had said, now that we're talking all the way back in 1900, he said there's a certain class of colored people who want to keep grievances in the forefront, or else they'll lose their job. This is 1900. I'd say 120 years later, we've got those same people who want to keep the grievances up in the forefront rather than focus on progress and strength.
How do you think it's going to go? Do you see any reason to hope people are starting to see the light on this craziness?
I think they are. You know, that silly expression, jumping the shark. I think they've gone too far. And I hope I'm not just being a Pollyanna about it, because all these years I've seen things improve so much. I hate to see them devolve. And when you talk to people offline, they know it's hokum. But people have to feel like they've got to say, oh, yes, we're systemically racist and do this and do that. They're just saying it. It's all for show. In their hearts, they know that people are people and jerks will be jerks and good guys will be good guys.
You speaking out so forcefully will help them. I mean, part of it is just someone seeing the example and realizing, oh, there is another way of thinking about this, and I am not the only one thinking that way. Marilyn, thank you so much. Please come back. I want to have you back on medicine, on law, on all of this BS. It's been a pleasure to meet you.
It's great to meet you. Thanks. And I'd be happy to come back.
All right, it's done. It's happening. All the best to you.